I'm trying to not look at this very much. My very high tech. I love stationery, and so I get a lot of gifts because people are like, "You love stationery." Yeah. How do I do this with the tabbies?
No, no, it's fine. We let you know soon. The center table.
That's sorry. That's Hello, everyone. Are you ready? Are you ready? Is this working? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Hello, thank you for coming on this beautiful Friday afternoon to spend time with us in the basement. We appreciate you. My name's Sam Gordon. I'm with Tech Equity. We're really excited to be here with you today. I think it's not a secret that everyone is talking about AI. I think my last count was we're at 45 bills that specifically name AI. And a number of informational hearings. Many of you have helped bring them together, so thank you for that. We wanted to get folks together today to really talk about this from what we're calling a people first policy approach. So for those of you I haven't met yet, just to give you a sense, Tech Equity, we are a nonprofit. We focus on addressing economic inequities inside the tech industry and equity issues that result from tech's products and business models. And we tend to focus on issues at the intersection of housing and labor. And as AI has come into play, we are talking a lot to our partners in DC and other places that do tech policy who are saying, how can we help actual advocates and communities on the ground? And I think everyone has been really clear that California is the place where this gets done in the US, for better or worse at this point. So we wanted to bring folks together to have a conversation and talk with folks that are working closely with communities who are impacted by technology. So a couple quick things before we get started. This event is happening here in person, but it's also being live streamed by our wonderful team here. And so folks are joining on Zoom. This will be recorded. So just want to make sure folks know that. We use a code of conduct for all of the events we do, which basically says, you know, create a safe space for learning. Please be respectful of other people, even if you may not agree with them, as often happens in policy spaces. Because we have folks on Zoom, we're going to try and make sure they're able to ask questions at the end as well. So for those of you in the room, there are question cards. You should feel free to write questions in on there. Lily and Herman, who are here from our team, will be happy to collect them from you and make sure that we get questions from the Zoom and from you in the room. And I think that's mostly it. Oh, I also want to thank Garrett Jensen and Assemblymember McCarty's office for helping us put all of these events together. This is the first in a series that we're going to be doing. We have upcoming events coming on AI in competition, AI in elections, AI in hiring, and we're looking at a variety of other sort of equity intersections on this. Okay, ready? So we recently issued a set of AI policy principles from Tech Equity, which really outline what we think should be in place anytime we're doing policy around these issues. And essentially what they say is that the people who are most impacted by AI have to be in the discussion about its design, its development, its deployment, and that we really need to think about where the burden of proof lies. And that's connected to the people who are most impacted. All of you know, we do not have an ex-ante policy system here in California or the US. Often it is reliant upon the people who have experienced harm to pursue their rights. And under these systems, that's really difficult because it's not obvious what went into their design, what went into their data. And so we really need to think about where the burden of proof lies under these systems and make sure people have the information they need to effectively enforce their existing and future rights. And then finally, as we'll talk about more in upcoming events, we think that the real way to tackle some of these problems is to make sure we're paying attention to concentrated power and data asymmetries that exist in this burgeoning market. Really thinking about how do a handful of players set the terms of how technology is developed, who has access to it, and making sure that we've set conditions for there to be competition. So with that, I would love to talk to you all and introduce our panelists. I'm going to have each of them just introduce themselves and say where they're coming from. And then we'll jump into questions to sort of talk first about how do we put a people first policy agenda in place? How do we center the people who are most likely to be impacted by this technology? So maybe I'll start with you, Haley.
So hi, I'm Haley Tsukayama. I'm Associate Director of Legislative Activism at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit devoted to making sure the rights we have in the brick and mortar world translate to the online world. And I specifically manage our state policy work.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Flux. I'm with the California Labor Federation. We represent 2.2 million union members in 1,200 affiliated unions, public, private, construction trades in California.
Hi, folks. My name is Jake Snow. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Northern California on the Tech and Civil Liberties team. And the Tech and Civil Liberties team works on consumer privacy, government surveillance, and free speech online. And artificial intelligence comes up in all of those areas. So yeah, it's great to be here.
Thank you all for being here. One of the things I think is really exciting about this moment is that all of us have been getting together on a regular basis, along with other unions, worker advocates, civil rights groups, consumer advocates, to say, how are we in a collaborative conversation about this moment? And how are we making sure that we're knitting together our collective values and priorities? Because AI and emerging technologies are kind of everywhere. They sort of touch everything. So each of you, as you mentioned, works with slightly different sort of areas of this and communities. And I wonder if we could just start with each of you sharing kind of what you're seeing in your world and what AI has meant for the people you work with and advocate for. And whoever wants to go first, jump in. Jake.
Okay.
Jake.
Thank you for turning your head towards me. I appreciate that. I'll talk about two examples of how AI and algorithmic systems more broadly have come up in our work. First of all is just how facial recognition is used by governments on people as part of the criminal legal system and more broadly in the commercial sphere. Folks are probably aware of path-breaking research by Timnit Gebru and Joy Buolamwini called Gender Shades, which demonstrated that facial recognition algorithms are less accurate when they are looking at faces of women and people of color. That has real consequences for what it means when people of color or women are matched as part of a criminal legal investigation. And so our work has focused on, number one, trying to elevate people's awareness and knowledge of those disparities, but also talking about the consequences, not just if facial recognition is inaccurate, and it doesn't accurately identify someone, but if it does accurately identify someone, what does it mean for the government to be able to identify people who are at a protest or who are driving their car or walking down the street somewhere, and they can find that person, and then maybe there's a criminal investigation because a crime happened nearby, and all of a sudden that person has a police officer with a gun at their door. Like, what are the consequences for communities of that dynamic? Our work has focused on activism and organizing at the local level. And so we were able to put in place strong prohibitions against facial recognition use by governments in San Francisco and Oakland and lots of other cities and counties around the country. And so that's one where it may not seem like it's a AI tool because it's just an implementation of technology. But it is, and the solutions and approaches to tech equity's values, in our view, have to start with thinking about the impact of that technology on communities, and not sort of envisioning that the regulation or the limits of technology like facial recognition is just a problem of like engineering or system design. It's about getting feedback and understanding the impact on communities when it's deployed in the real world, which is discriminatory and racist and violent and harmful and puts people into precarity all the time. And algorithms have an impact on what that means for people as they live their lives. So to me, that's kind of the first place where this model of thinking through artificial intelligence and technology more broadly can learn from how we've thought about these kinds of tools in the past.
Okay. For where labor's at, I'm gonna go back in time a little bit. How many people have heard of the Luddites? All right. I've been called a Luddite because I wouldn't give up my BlackBerry. It's come to mean, right, like people who are anti-technology. But if you go back to the actual story of the Luddites, and there's a great book on this called Blood in the Machine by Brian Merchant, who we had come speak to a group of a convening of unions in October. The real story is that the Luddites were skilled weavers. They were skilled, they were trained, they were well paid, they controlled their work, they got to work in their communities and cottages, they were in guilds. They were treated well. And then the technology of the mechanized loom came in, and the merchants who were like, ooh, cotton, we can make garments, we can ship this stuff. We're like, why don't we put people in factories? Why don't we make it really hot and dangerous? We'll break down the skills so everyone's doing a separate job and they can never advance. The wages will be low. They'll inhale lots of cotton, so it's harmful and dangerous. And we'll just get rid of all these really expensive skilled workers. And the Luddites fought back. And that's why we know about them, because they basically said they weren't anti-technology. They're like, actually, the mechanized loom could make our work a lot better. It could be faster. But the way you're doing it is you're basically destroying our livelihood. You're destroying your communities. You're exploiting workers. We think there's a better way. We can figure it out. Why don't you have kind of retirement systems? Why don't you have us involved? Because we know the craft. And didn't go so well. So they ended up smashing the machines and unfortunately being massacred. Fast forward. We feel that way about technology in the labor movement. It can be used to be productive, but it is not actually neutral, because technology is developed by tech companies, used by employers, and it's being used in a way that's doing the same thing as that happened to the Luddites. And so as the labor movement, we really feel like we've got to change everything up. We need to be, and workers need to be involved in the development of technology, in the deployment of technology, in the way it is used. There needs to be oversight on the decisions that are used. And there's some things that are simply a no-go. I mean, one of the things that we came up with in our principles is that there is dignity in work. There is a reason that people are in workplaces. We fight to make these workplaces better, but people take pride in work, and that's part of it. And so we very much are looking at this as both something that is not very new, even though the technologies are. The impacts are very, very old. And it's something that we know how to deal with. And so that is very much what we are going to try to do. We want to be at the table at every point. That's why I also think your boss's roles are so important, because we need those guardrails in place to kind of slow this down and have something like, you know, we used to have child labor and no minimum wage. We put those guardrails into place. We still need unions. And so I think the work that you all are doing is really, really important. And we look forward to working with you.
I like going last because then I have to say less. So agree with all that. You know, for us, I think a lot of it is, you know, EFF has worked on tech policy for a long time. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in this moment around AI, you know, questions about how data is collected, how it's used, right? It's sort of the same problems and the principles that we've been talking about for a long time. But the scale and the speed at which people are going to process data, collect data, has changed. And so that is like one thing we want to say, look, we've talked about these principles, we've communicated them, like continue to apply them to this new form of technology. And, similarly, I think, so my past life, I was a tech reporter for the Washington Post. And so I've seen a cycle like this play out before, right? Where people are sort of trusting that the technology will be the magic thing, that to quote a thing I read this morning, that these are tools that have mastered confidence before they've mastered accuracy, and making sure that as we're thinking about deploying them, both in the public sector and the private sector, that we are really carefully thinking about what do they do, what protections do we need to make sure that individuals are protected from the possible harms of these things, and then when do you need them? Sometimes you do need them, and that's good, but it's good to have that thought process first.
Thank you all. I was saying to folks this morning, last night I met with, folks may know there's a EU team in San Francisco that's here as ambassadors to help work with implementing the Digital Markets Act and the upcoming AI Act. And our executive director and I were meeting with them, and they said, but of course you have to regulate to spur innovation. You cannot grow a market if people do not trust the products. All of the polling shows that people do not trust these products because they are not regulated. You cannot put a car on the street without regulating it, making sure the brakes work, right? Regulations are what brought us airbags, seat belts. That's how the market has grown. And so I think to, some of what folks are raising, and also Sarah's point in particular, we at Tech Equity feel really strongly that to be pro-technology is to make sure that you have common sense guardrails in place so that innovation can work in a way that benefits people, right? That isn't just put upon them. So I'd love to just push into these sort of a couple more specifics on these areas that we're concerned about. And Sarah, I'd love to talk to you about some of what has been reported and folks have been organizing around with hotel workers and housekeepers, because I think it's a really good example of how technology can atomize work and really have a detrimental impact to workers. I think the hospitality industry has adopted algorithmic management tools across hotels and hotel operations, and housekeepers have been reporting some of the highest hospitality injury rates. Yet the tools and apps are now directing their work in a way that increases the likelihood of injury. So in the past, they could sort of structure which rooms they went to. So a checkout room is going to be more physically intensive. So you might put a turnover room next on your docket, but these apps are now directing how they move through the floors, what rooms they have to hit. They're setting quotas. And I know you've done a lot of work on sort of these productivity quotas and what they mean for workers, not just in hotels, but also in warehouses. And I wonder kind of if you could talk about the algorithmic management tools and where they're showing up outside of hotels, and what these sorts of technologies mean for workers right now and how you guys think about them.
I mean, there's a story that I read about an Amazon warehouse, because we did a bill a couple of years ago, AB 701, on quotas in warehouses. The story was they brought in a system of algorithmic management, and it was trying to figure out how to absolutely maximize people moving products. I don't even know what they were doing, getting it out of the box and moving it. And they were like, it would be way more effective if you could have 1.5 workers in this space. And the management had to be like, well, they're actually human beings. We can't do 1.5. You can't split them. So that's just an example. These quotas, these systems are designed to maximize efficiency, and they don't care if they're literally breaking people in the process. And so one of the things that we've really looked at, the hotel industry is a great example because we do have really strong unions. And so in the recent negotiations, actually in the casinos in Detroit, and then 2018, I believe, with Unite Here negotiations, they got a lot of good language around having human oversight of algorithmic management, not having it control workers, not having it being able to fire or discipline workers without human oversight. And that was also the point of AB 701, was that you should not be able to use algorithmic management that causes people to actually have to violate labor or health and safety laws to meet the quotas. I mean, it seems ridiculous that we have to do a bill like that, but we did. And now it's actually a model. It's moving in other states. So I think that is a big piece of it, is making sure that, yes, maybe this can be used to measure and look at productivity, but you can't allow this to just treat people like machines. I mean, it goes back to what we've said. We were saying this, and we still are saying this about farm workers. They are not machines. You cannot treat them that way. Now we have something that people think is new and shiny and smarter that is doing the same thing. And that's, I think, a flag. And one of the differences between the Luddites and us is that people are in love with tech. And in California, especially, I just got off last week, was on a call with our national AFL around some of the work that we're all doing nationally around labor and like technology and automation. We have a bigger challenge in California because this is the home of Silicon Valley, and there's a lot more of a love affair with the products and a lot of trust. Like, they'll figure it out, like Uber and Lyft, Waymo and Cruise. They'll figure out our traffic problems. And really, they're breaking the system, not disrupting it. And so I think we need to be extra careful about that here, that we're making sure we're not putting too much faith in these machines and looking to human oversight over the tools.
So one thing, Jake and Haley, to an extent, you both brought up in your sort of areas you're focused on, was this idea of technology that is harmful, right? All of you were bringing that up. So recently, I think folks know the EU passed the AI Act, and something that I thought was really interesting and hopeful in there was Article 5, which outlines the unacceptable uses of technology, and that includes remote biometric surveillance. It includes social scoring systems and a variety of other types of technology that they just said, full stop. There are no use cases in which this could not be harmful, and the likelihood for egregious harm is so high that we can't actually allow these to come into the market, even with regulation. So I'm curious, maybe Haley and Jake, feel free to jump in. Could you talk about what you see in sort of that realm of unacceptable technology, and what does that mean, and how are those types of technology sort of impacting people here in California?
So I can kick it off. I mean, so I was, I saw this question, so I have my little post-it of what
I'm
what
looking
are the
at my
unacceptable uses. But kind of the basic framework is, they're saying AI that threatens rights. So you mentioned biometric scanning, untargeted facial scraping, emotion recognition in schools and workplaces. And they've also, they're talking about AI that manipulates human behavior and exploits vulnerabilities. So, I mean, I think EFF doesn't throw the ban word around very often, but I do think when we're looking at the EU, I think we do EFF does want to see like greater attention paid to these tools that can be used to make consequential decisions. So definitely like the housing work you've done, definitely stuff in the workplace. I think it's a very good model to say, everybody has to look at their tools and figure out like what are the risks and the harm potential before they're putting this out in the world. And I said we don't throw the ban word around very often, but one example of when we do is we don't think that law enforcement should be able to use face recognition, right? And that is based on a preponderance of evidence from all over the world that says that that is just a tool that is too dangerous in the hands in that scenario. And I might throw it to you, Jake. That's a good setup, right?
Plus one to that. And other areas that I think that's true are places that where algorithms might be used in a way that's just going to have like consequential and disastrous impacts on people's lives. And in particular situations, like in predictive policing, where a tool has been trained on past data from the criminal legal system, which is infused with the racial and racist enforcement priorities that the criminal legal system has been plagued with from the beginning. And so, that data just can't be, you can't build it into a product that then operates in a way that is fair or that does not include the racism and violence on which it was built. And so that's another example of something where people's rights are implicated, going back to Article 5, and also because of the unique position of how the criminal legal system has worked in the United States, I think that kind of application should be off the table. I also think that you can just kind of talk about instances where algorithmic tools violate the law already, right? Like there are a lot of laws on the books, and I think that there is there's this like narrative, and maybe it's not a popular narrative in this building, and I'm pleased about that, but there's this narrative that like technology moves faster than the law does. One reason why that might be the case is that there's like an immense set of powerful interests who are trying to slow down the development of the law. And so like the people who are saying technology moves faster than the law are but also the people who are slowing down the development of the law. So I just like make that as a side observation. But with respect to things like civil rights laws, we have the Unruh Civil Rights Act in California. And if a tool that is delivering advertisements to people is not delivering job advertisements to women, but is prioritizing men for certain jobs, like that's just a violation of civil rights law in California. It doesn't matter that it is happening through an algorithm. And in fact, it's even more harmful because it's happening maybe like hundreds or thousands or millions of times rather than just a smaller number of times if it's happening like in a print medium. So complying with like existing law and the prohibitions that exist in existing law and applying those to algorithmic tools in a way that might feel unfamiliar, but is in fact just how the legal system should work, I think are other examples.
So I want to push us into a little bit on some of the principles and concepts we could be using to actually affirmatively develop a vision for technology that centers the people who are most impacted. So I think maybe it makes sense to start with data and privacy as sort of foundational to some of these pieces. Obviously, this has been a big topic of conversation in California with the passage of CCPA and CIPRA following. And recently there was an issue for a notice of, I always get this wrong, like pre-rulemaking, from the privacy agency on risk assessments. So I'm curious, maybe Haley, we could start with you. Why do you think privacy and data rights are so important to ensuring people are, centered and protected in this AI conversation? And where do you think we're excelling, and where do you think there are maybe opportunities for improvement here in California?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think at a really basic level, right? Like data is the fuel for these systems. It's the fuel for a lot of things, but certainly the scale of collection and the way that it's being processed, you need data to do that. And, at EFF, we have always said we want the individual to have a sense of data autonomy, right? Like a sense of control over where their information goes and how it's used. And so again, as we're kind of seeing this accelerate, it's more important than ever, right, to make sure that you have a grasp on that first as a first principle, right? Centering the human, centering the person, before you build on that policy. And I think, there is a good acknowledgement of that idea. Like when I talk to people, it seems like they get it, but I don't know how much attention is really paid or weight given when somebody's in your office saying, this is my fantastic technology and this is how it works and all this stuff, that I think it's very easy to lose sight of the individual. And so that is where I'd like to see us grow a little bit.
Yeah, and Jake, you were just talking about this a little bit in your remarks, but obviously, ACLU's thing is kind of protecting people's civil liberties. You guys have been doing that for a minute. So I'm curious, like, given what you were just laying out and the way in which some of these systems can interact with existing laws. We think about this in housing, a lot of these algorithms, there are different sets of laws that exist on a different jurisdictional levels around fair chance housing. And we can't tell that the algorithms are following those laws, right? And the people that are trying to access housing don't know if the algorithms are rejecting them because they're not following these laws. So I'm curious, from a principles or a concepts level, what do you think is required at a basic level to ensure that the rights we have aren't eroded by sort of these models or algorithms that are being put in place, and how those complicate our ability to pursue recourse for harm?
Well, just to go back to Haley's point, we have the CCPA, we have the new agency. They're doing the hard and important regulatory work. But we can go way back in time in California to 1972 when we passed the constitutional right to privacy. And the ballot pamphlet for the constitutional right to privacy in California talks about how people have privacy rights in how information about them is used. And that could be, is information about you used in a way that might embarrass you? Something could be disclosed that you don't want to be disclosed to the public. It could be a disclosure in terms of the way it's used. But it can also just be like, are you okay with the fact that a photo of you or a photo of your family, your children, your loved ones, your community is used to train a facial recognition algorithm that's sold to the military? Like, are you cool with that? That's a privacy violation. And it's right there in the California Constitution. So it's sort of, there's a long tradition of that in California. To the point about how, what approaches we might be looking to. I mean, I think we should really just start with, and it's been a big part of this discussion, harm prevention, right? Like, don't let the harms happen in the first place. I was talking to somebody recently and they used the phrase, no harm repair, bureaucracy, hellscape. Right. And I think that is, I want to put it on a t-shirt because if you harm people, you cause the harm to people, people's bodies, people's communities. And then you say, well, it's okay. Fill out a couple of forms, go down to your local regulator, file a report, file an appeal in the system that harmed you. Then, if somebody will look at it, you'll get on the phone, probably with another AI that's going to tell you you don't have, that everything's fine. Like just like forcing people into the bureaucracy of harm repair is a recipe for permitting harm and in fact encouraging it. And so, just like stopping the harm before it happens, I think is the really important thing. And then having a systemic focus and thinking about how technologies are deployed in the real world rather than in sort of the abstract world where we assume that everyone has infinite amounts of time to dedicate to protecting themselves, their families. People have a lot of knowledge about how these systems work. People have lives, they have jobs, they have communities that need to be cared for. And so the burden shouldn't be on the people to be doing that work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that breaks my heart every time I talk about the EU and the AI Act, actually, is there's a different approach there where we're going to ensure that harm is not likely to happen before products come onto the market. And we have that here, right, for certain things, but we don't have that when it comes to AI and algorithms. Sarah, I think if we could shift to you, I think one of my hobby horses, I assume it's probably yours too, is that AI is unique and algorithmic and algorithmic systems, emerging technologies. It's unique in the workplace because not only are workers experiencing the technology, they're often required to deploy the technology on the customers or the clients that they're serving. So they have this dual role. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what do you see as foundational principles or rights that workers must have when new technology comes into the workplace?
There's a lot that I could say. I mean, I think our first premise is that workers should be involved in the development, if that's not possible, in the procurement and deployment of technology. And this is any technology. We see this in transit. Sometimes like transit agencies will buy these shiny new buses, not even automated, like just shiny new buses. And then the bus drivers are like, clearly this does not work. I drive this route every day. And so there's this disconnect between what is being purchased and who's actually using that. And in technology, it becomes even more increased. And so definitely wanting to make sure that that piece is there. And then in every industry, there is a real concern that if you don't have human oversight, worker oversight of the technology, it can go haywire. And we see this everywhere. I see my colleague from the California nurses in the back nodding. I mean, healthcare is a great example. You have technology. We know all in healthcare, like you have to go to school for years, you have to get a license, you have to pass all these tests to be a healthcare professional. What does AI have to do? Is it like going to WebMD and like scraping information and like reading x-rays? There's a lot of, and we heard the stories from nurses. They came and presented at one of our convenings about AIs making decision that they know is wrong. And it's not clear if they're able to override it within their scope of practice. In the public sector, benefits eligibilities, the use by child protective services, in terms of criminal justice, even just, okay, we're going to eliminate court reporters and then it's just going to be what? Like the AI? I mean, it can barely do like voice texting, but that's what some people are going to have to rely on in terms of the courts. And so looking at how many things that we're like, oh, AI can do it, but these are consequential decisions in people's lives, like calling to see whether you get your unemployment insurance benefits and you have an AI system that's doing it. You know, we just saw in Michigan, they had this fancy high tech system that was doing UI fraud screening. And they found that 93% of the people that they had said you fraudulently got UI benefits, that AI was wrong. It was programmed wrong. But yet people had filed bankruptcy. They had lost their I mean, the human—
It was 40,000 people.
40, yeah. The human devastation as a result of the fact that someone programmed this wrong. And like, there was no person to like listen to someone's story. I've actually forgotten what the question was, but my answer is like, we have to be very, very careful. And this is everywhere. And I just want to go back to the privacy piece too. Predictive behavior analysis is really scary. Like just the idea that you can predict who's going to file a complaint or stand up or form a union or even get pregnant so you can like not deny them benefits because it's too expensive, whatever it is. I think we have to be very careful about it and make sure there's a very clear analysis on the impact of both workers, the public that they serve, and the consumers that they serve.
I'm going to shift us to some of the solutions and opportunities, but I want to also invite folks, if you have questions, to make sure to write those down or put them in the chat or the Q&A on the Zoom, probably the Q&A on the Zoom, so we can make sure to save some time for questions. Haley, I thought it might be useful to talk about EFF and how you think about sort of solutions and opportunities. I think folks know if you're in legislative offices, EFF usually plays a pretty unique role in policy spaces because of your commitment to free speech and privacy. And at times, I know you can end up on the opposite sides of an argument with folks that you're friends with and share values with. And I wondered if you could actually just share what EFF's vision is for how we can go upstream to protect people through privacy, competition, other means, to regulate the technologies in a way that sort of disincentivizes the production of harm farther up more comprehensively.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think of it as the like, what is EFF steal question, which is a thing that I have asked myself, especially early on. I mean, so really EFF's primary frame is to empower individuals, which I've talked about, right? So yes, that means privacy, but also making sure that people have free access to information, that they can speak, that they can build tools to make, to kind of slip in and make products better, or to make the new product that is better, that is more privacy protective, that is more whatever. And so it really does come down to like autonomy and choice. And also like being able to move stuff between platforms. So really like, this is my information, this is my data. If I want to go to a competitor, I should be able to take my information and go. And so, that does lead us to some interesting positions sometimes. I think a lot of that is a lot of why we focus on like data collection. So, really thinking about when you're thinking about a data flow, like that is the first step. Like, when did they get my information? And then you can kind of choose like, okay, maybe I do want to opt into the facial recognition on my phone because I have kids and I don't always have my hands and I want to be able to unlock my phone. Like that's a choice that people should be able to make, but it isn't a choice that should be made for them. And so that is really, and again, like when we're looking at AI, like maybe you want your information to be in a model that is trained to do X, Y, or Z, but that should be a choice that you have.
Thank you. Jake, you've talked about this, but you guys work a lot on surveillance systems that operate in the private sector and also that operate in public spaces. Wondering if you can talk about ways we can tackle that technology and other forms of AI that are encroaching on our privacy, in particular in public spaces, and if there's been any successful models for kind of overseeing that.
Well, when it comes to surveillance, there is kind of like a marriage of convenience between industry and the government that crops up a lot, especially in the criminal space. And the example that I'll give of that is social media surveillance, where there's a lot of private vendors who are looking at the internet, both public material and non-public material, and they're gathering all of that information from the public internet, and then they are selling it in analyzed form by putting it in maps, digesting it, making predictions about what people are going to do, and they're selling it as a surveillance tool to the police. In 2016, going back to then, we found that a company called Geophedia was doing this, and in fact, they were allowing the police to surveil Black Lives Matter protesters who were organizing online. And that's happened again and again with protests around the country as those a lot of those protests specifically are about raising people's voices against police violence. And then the surveillance tools that are being used are revealing people's presence, people's locations, what people are saying to the police, and even potentially flagging that conduct as being threatening. And so that is an example of something where there is both the problem of the profit motive and also the problem of the government having like biased priorities when it comes to enforcing criminal law and biased priorities when it comes to enforcing the law against people who are speaking out against government misconduct. And so there are a couple of models that I think are useful. And actually, this is one area where there is a possibility of having a real way for companies to do some good work here. After we revealed that Geophedia was being used by law enforcement to surveil protesters around the country, both Facebook and Twitter put in place policies that they made strong promises to people to say, we will not allow data from our platforms to be used for law enforcement surveillance. Those promises have been in place for almost 10 years now. And in fact, at the end of last year, we sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission saying it looks like some of those promises actually aren't being kept, because if you look around, there are a lot of companies who are making some pretty scary claims about what they're able to do by surveilling people's conduct on social media, the profiles they're generating of people, the networks of people's connections they're tracking and revealing to law enforcement and surfacing in a dashboard that law enforcement can use at any time. And so there's a law enforcement option, which is that the companies can actually like enforce the promises they've made, but also if they don't, then just entities that enforce accurate advertising laws can say, look, you're not keeping your promises to people, and this has to stop. So companies can do better, and if they don't, then the government has to step in to stop this kind of harm from happening by other areas of the government. Pit the government against itself.
Last question before we move to Q&A, and we've got a bunch of good questions. Sarah, you were talking about sort of this idea, which our friend Dr. Bernhardt from the Berkeley Labor Center has been calling worker in the loop. So how do we have a worker in the loop for these various stages in the process? And I wonder if there are examples from unions that you work with of where this is happening. I know you mentioned Unite Here has won some really good language. If there are examples or opportunities we could look to of where this is going in a better direction.
I broke the tack. The entertainment union SAG-AFTRA, WGA, they really put negotiating over technology at the center of their contracts. IATSE, which are the below the line workers, are going into negotiations. You know, people don't think of them because that no one sees them. They run the crews, the makeup artists, the costume designers. AI hits them first. They're already eliminating costume designers and makeup artists, replacing it with AI. The sets are different, so they're going to be going in strong. The transportation unions have done incredible work. TWU just got an incredible contract in Ohio requiring massive advance notice, negotiations over the use of different technologies that impact their essential job functions. But really every union, I mean, we have convenings and it will be everything from the building trades to nurses to grocery workers. Technology is impacting people and workers in every single industry. And so they all are figuring out what is a tool, how do we want to use it, and doing very industry specific work. And so there's incredible things happening. Unite Here has great model language. We're trying to compile model language and hopefully figure out how we can apply that more broadly to non-union workers. One thing that we did, AB 96, it was a CARA bill. It made the introduction of autonomous vehicles in public transit a mandatory subject of bargaining, which is really important because usually there's certain things we can negotiate on and certain things that are just management prerogative. We're pulling technology more and more into that's not management's prerogative. That is a mandatory subject of bargaining. And that's something that the entertainment unions did in their contracts. They put it at the center. And for WGA, they're not into a total ban. They want to use ChatGPT as a tool. And so every union's very different. And there's a lot of great models out there, and it's things we're trying to share and learn, and hopefully we'll have some things compiled.
These are great questions. Good job, team. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can, and then happy to stay. I can stay after, happy to help answer any other questions we don't get to. So the first one is, what are the core questions we as legislative staff should ask when AI bills come up? What are the pitfalls we should avoid?
Gonna play speaking chicken again. I mean, for me, I think it really is like, who are the people who are most affected by what's being proposed? How do we get them in a room? Like, how do we talk to them? I'm sure you think similarly. And then, kind of what is the existing law in this area and how does that apply to what's being proposed here? And I think also, like, is this a necessary use of this technology? So that's kind of this off the top of my head.
I guess one thing I would ask is whether the folks that are pushing for the legislation are doing so to protect their profit and their business model. We all see bills that might be advanced by entities that would be regulated by it, and I think there's just like a couple of heaping spoonfuls of skepticism that you can have for that kind of effort, because I think it seems sort of obvious, but you might as well say it out loud, is that those bills are being advanced so that regulations can be put in place that then clears the way for and eliminates the possibility of like real strong regulations in the future. We've seen that happen in California, and it continues to be ongoing in terms of a strategy. And so just like being very skeptical of the well-meaning company that comes or trade group that comes in and says like, here are some rules of the road to regulate us. I think that's probably not a good model. So that's what I would look to.
I would just add to that one of the things I would encourage staff to, in addition to the skepticism, is to think about power when you're in the room. And I feel like, I work at a nonprofit. I worked for SEIU for 13 years prior to that. We are often on defense, having to prove constantly that what we say is an issue, having to trot out hundreds of workers. And if we can't trot out hundreds of workers, then it must not be real. Meanwhile, industry gets to walk in and say, this is going to kill jobs. This is going to be terrible. And that's seen as valid. And so I think that, of course, we want to make sure that there's competition. Of course, we want, as we've been saying, there to be technology that can be helpful to people. But I would just encourage you and plea to, consider the power imbalances. For us to get a worker to come here during the day to testify at a hearing, they're losing wages, they're losing work. We work with contract workers. Many of them will not be public because they will get blacklisted in tech. They won't get another job. We've had contract workers who have testified with us because they're part of Alphabet Workers Union, so they feel some protections through that union. They're not getting picked up for contracts. One worker got her contract canceled right after she testified with us publicly. So I would just ask you to be cognizant of what you put on advocates versus what you put on industry. And I know that's not just staff, right? That's members, but that is really difficult for us. We're small, we're a nonprofit, we're foundation funded. I know all of us are sort of scrapping to bring all of this together. So that's one thing I would say is also just think about the power imbalances and where the burden is being placed. How do we make sure that people impacted by AI can be part of regulating it? Meet with Sarah.
I mean, we have a website called Unionized California. You can put in your information, join. No, I mean, I think we always say there's no substitute for a collective bargaining agreement. There just is no other substitute. That's why we really want to see people in unions for many reasons, but that's the best way to make sure when it's deployed in the workplace or it's used to serve the public or consumers that they're involved. And I think building it in, like there's some bills that I think are moving on impact assessments before a technology is used and adding in that there should be worker, consumer, whoever is kind of going to be touched by the technology involved in the impact assessment. And having those floors, those guardrails, those protections, so that people also have a way, if there's violations, that there's somewhere they can go to get it enforced. So strong enforcement of whatever is put into place. And yeah, I mean, I think those are the big ones. It's hard. I'm just going to speak on the workplace side. But the power imbalance is real. Like people are not going to opt out of things. Like if you're trying to get a job or a raise or not get fired, you're not going to opt out of a technology that your boss is like, here's this technology, you can opt out. You're just not going to do that. Like how many times do you get hired and you sign like 8,000 forms? Like you're not going to be like, oh no, I'm not going to sign this form that allows you to surveil me at work. Like there's a power imbalance that is so real, you could lose your entire livelihood. And so I think we also have to be cognizant about that and create the ways to kind of level a little bit the playing field, or at least have the enforcement if there is retaliation to protect workers.
Can I add one thing? I think it's worth just dedicating some creative thought to the the organizations that might be good places to reach out to, who represent particular impacted communities. And so, you might see an AI bill and then think, well, like how would this affect survivors of domestic violence? Right? Like it might be a little bit of an out of the box question to reach out to an org that represents those folks. But I do think that doing that can give you a sense of how that community is impacted, even though, maybe that org, and not to be specific about survivors of domestic violence, but any other community as well, they might not be, giving you a call on a particular bill, but they might be impacted. And so dedicating some thought to how to reach out to orgs that do immigrants' rights work or reproductive rights work or anything on bills that maybe don't immediately have that impact, but where you might detect that there's a real concern there, I think is a useful thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, just to jump on both of your points, I think, a lot of advocate, because as you know, EFF knows tech, but we don't know housing, we don't know repro, we don't know all these areas that are getting touched. And a lot of times we'll reach out to groups and they'll go, "Oh gosh, I had no idea that this bill was happening. I had no idea that this was touching my, sorry, advocacy area." And so it sort of takes me back to being a reporter, where like they call it the sourcing snail, where you have like the obvious person to call, and then you kind of spiral out and you think, okay, who else is touched by this? Who else is going? And like I think that's really important to think about.
I like that snail image. I can hold that. The other thing I would just say on AI specifically is to be careful about transparency or noticing only approaches, because of the way that that's been used, in particular in data systems. We're going to notice you that this is happening. And once we've done that, that clears the way for us to do whatever we want with it. So I would just, that's like one particular to this use case that I would just encourage folks to meet with some skepticism and ask questions. Transparency can be really important in these systems. It's not a bad thing, but if that's where it stops and that's seen as foundational or the only thing we have to do, or the noticing is the only thing, it can open the door for all sorts of uses that folks wouldn't be comfortable with. So that's like one specific thing I would say to be skeptical of. I think we can do one more. Are we okay? I'm looking at our team. Okay. All right. This is a really fun one. Where do the panelists believe oversight over AI in California is best housed? Privacy. I think it says DOT, but I bet you mean Department of Technology, California Department of Technology, the AG, some multi-agency infrastructure. Do you guys have thoughts? This is not an easy question, whoever wrote it.
I'll just say I don't think that that you can house it in one place. And I also think that housing it in one place is a recipe for the risk of capture of that agency. I will say that I worked for the Federal Trade Commission for 5 years. It is the only agency that enforces the FTC Act. There's like 1,000 lawyers at the FTC. It does a lot of amazing work, but like there's no reason why the FTC needs to be the only agency to do that. Like lots of other, like just individual people can also do some of that enforcement. And then also other government entities as well. And so I think like locating law enforcement authority when it comes to constraining harmful corporate conduct needs to be a sort of all hands on deck situation. So that's just a sort of a first thing. But then second, I talked at the very beginning about the fact that, in my work on government surveillance and privacy and free speech, AI comes up everywhere. And so it is just something that's going to be emerging as an issue across like sort of many areas of society, like how algorithms and computerized systems are impacting people's lives. And so, like AI needs to be something that the Labor Department and the employment regulators and everyone needs to be up to speed on. So I don't think it should be housed in one place. It should be housed everywhere.
I just want to agree with that. Like, I think that empowers AI. Not that it's a thing, but it's a little similar to how Uber and Lyft and WeWork and all these other companies were like, we're technology companies. We're like, you're not a technology company. You're a landlord. WeWork. You're a taxi cab. You're just using a different tool. And so I do think it buys into this like tech myth to regulate it in one place. And then that puts us at a disadvantage because we're not experts. And they like to say that, well, you don't understand it. You're not a scientist. We don't need to. We know how it's impacting the people we represent. You all know how to regulate things. So I think we just need to put it back in its place of, yes, this is a powerful, amazing, crazy tool that's out there, but the way it's being used to impact the public is not that different than other things. Like the Teamsters always give this example of like, there were Teamsters back where there were horses and buggies, and now we drive trucks, and we've been Teamsters all along. And so we kind of think of it as that way.
I think that's a good place for us to wrap. I want to thank all of you for being here. Two quick things. One is all of us are part of a AI working group, along with other folks, like we mentioned, consumer advocates, civil rights groups, unions, coming together to evaluate the bills that are moving, figuring out how we can offer suggestions to strengthen them, ensure that we have these concepts of workers in the loop, data minimization, all of these baked in. So if things are coming up, I would encourage you to reach out to us. We want to be helpful. And second is this is the first of a series of events where we're trying to go deeper and really bring folks that are, connected to these communities into the conversation. We want to make sure you have access to people who aren't just from the industry telling you these things are too complicated to regulate, but people that are connected to communities that can say, here's what it would really mean for this to be beneficial in our community. So would encourage you all to come to our future events. And thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you. And thank you to our esteemed panelists. Appreciate you guys always.